to be the next to be with you. I'm the one who wants to deep inside, I hope you feel it too. Waited on a line up, waited all my life, yeah, just to be the next to be with you. Just to be the next to be with you. This feeling any longer, and yet I'm still afraid to let it flow. What started out as friendship has grown stronger. I only wish I had the strength to let it show. I tell myself that I can't hold out forever. I say there is no reason for my fear, 'cause I feel so secure when we're together. You give my life direction, you make everything so clear. And even as I wander, I'm keeping you in sight. You're a candle in the window on a cold and dark winter's night. And I'm getting closer than I ever thought I might. Then I can't fight this feeling anymore. I've forgotten what I started fighting for. Time to bring this ship into shore and throw away the oars forever. 'Cause I can't fight this feeling anymore. I've forgotten what I started fighting for. And if I have to cross a road, come crashing through the door, baby, I can't fight this feeling anymore. Such a whirlwind since I saw you. I've been running around in circles in my mind, and it always seems that I'm following you, girl. 'Cause you take me to the places that alone I'd never find. And even as I wander, I'm keeping you in sight. You're a candle in the window on a cold dark winter's night. And I'm getting closer than I ever thought I might. But I can't fight this feeling anymore. I've forgotten what I started fighting for. It's time to bring this ship into the shore and throw away the oars forever. 'Cause I can't fight this feeling anymore. I've forgotten what I started fighting for. And Baby, I can't fight this feeling anymore.
I could hardly believe it when I heard the news today. I had to come and get it straight from you. They said you were leaving, someone swept your heart away. From that look on your face, I see it's true. So tell me all about it, tell me about the plans you're making. Oh, tell me one thing more before I go. Tell me, how am I supposed to live without you? Now that I've been loving you so long, how am I supposed to live without you? And how am I supposed to carry on when all that I've been living for is gone? Crying didn't come here to break down. Just a dream of mine is coming to an end. And how can I blame you when I built my world around the hope that one day we'd be so much more than friends? I don't want to know the price I'm gonna pay for dreaming. Oh, even now it's more than I can take. Tell me, how am I supposed to live without you? Now that I've been loving you so long, how am I supposed to live without you? And how am I supposed to carry on when all that I've been living for is gone? Now I don't want to know the price it's gonna pay for dreaming. Oh, now that your dream has come true, tell me, how am I supposed to live without you? Now that I've been loving you so long, how am I supposed to live without you? And how am I supposed to carry on
Out of home, one more bad break could bring a fall. When I'm far from home, don't call me on the phone to tell me you're alone. It's easy to deceive, it's easy to tease, but hard to get released. Eyes without a face, eyes without a face, eyes without a face. Got no human grace, your eyes without a face. I spend so much time believing all the lies, keep the dream alive. Now it makes me sad, it makes me mad and true, for loving what was you. Eyes without a face, eyes without a face, eyes without a face. Got no human grace, your eyes without a face. When you hear the music, you make it dip into someone else's pocket, then make it slip. Steal a car, go to Las Vegas. Oh, gigolo crew, hanging out by the state line, turning holy water into wine, drinking it down. I'm on a bus, on a psychedelic trip, reading murder books, trying to stay hip. I'm thinking of you, you're out there, so say your prayers, say your prayers, say your prayers. I close my eyes and I wonder why I don't despise. Now all I can do, love what was once so like you, but it's gone from your eyes. I better realize. Eyes without a face, eyes without a face, eyes without a face. Got no human grace, your eyes without a face. Such a human waste, your eyes without a face. No, it's getting worse.
needs a little time away. I've heard her say from each other. Even lovers need a holiday. Far away from each other. Oh, now it's hard for me to say I'm sorry. I just want you to stay. After all that we've been through, I will make it up to you. I promise to. And after all that's been said and done, you're just done. You're just a part of me. I can't let go. After all that we've been through, I will make it up to you. I promise to. You're gonna be the only one.
Gotta take a little time to think things over. I better read between the lines in case I need it when I'm older. This mountain I must climb feels like the world upon my shoulder. But through the clouds I see love shine. It keeps me warm as life grows colder. In my life there's been heartache and pain. I don't know if I can face it again. wanna feel what love is. I know you can show me. I'm gonna take a little time to look around me. I've got nowhere left to hide. It looks like love has finally found me. In my life, there's been heartache and pain. I don't know if I can face it again. Can't stop now. I've traveled so far to change this lonely life. I wanna know what love is. I want you to show me. I wanna feel what love is. I know you can show me. I wanna know what love is. I want you to show me. I wanna feel what love is. I know you can show me. Let's talk about love. Love that you feel inside. I'm feeling so much love. Oh, you just can't hide. I wanna know what love is. Let's talk about love. I know you can show me. I feel it. I wanna feel it too. And I know you can show me.
Say you, say me, say it for always. That's the way it should be. Say you, say me, say it together, naturally. I had a dream, I had an awesome dream. People in the park, playing games in the dark. And what they played was a masquerade. From behind the walls of doubt, a voice was crying out. Say you, say me, say it for always. That's the way it should be. Say you, say me, say it together. together, truly. As we go down life's lonesome highway, seems the hardest thing to do is to find a friend or two. That helping hand, someone who understands. When you feel you lost your way, you got someone there to say, I'll show you. Say you, say me, say it for always. Oh, that's the way it should be. Say you, say me, say it together, truly. Don't you think you know the answer? Oh no. Well, the whole world got you dancing. That's right, I'm telling you. Have the thought to leave it. Oh yeah. Believe in who you are. You are a shining star. Say you, say me, say it for all.
Good morning. On behalf of the organizing committee, I'd like to welcome all of you to Fundação Getúlio Vargas and Sibgrapi 2014. I hope that you have an enjoyable experience here with us. And I'd like to start by giving some information. At this time, probably you noticed that we have two different locations for the sessions. One's here. The other one is in the cultural center across the alley. And people will need an access card to come into the main building. Unfortunately, this card is only good for the day. So at the end of each day, you should return your card and get another one at the beginning of the next day. So those are the procedures here at FGV. So plenary sessions are going to be held here in this auditorium and are going to be broadcasted to the cultural center in case we have a crowd that exceeds the capacity of the auditorium. Coffee breaks and cocktail are going to be held at the cultural center. So during the day, you probably are going to be needing to go from one place to the other. Every information about things which are not present in the program are going to be published in the Facebook site of Sibgrapi 2014. So for those of you who are users of Facebook, I advise you to go often there, because up-to-date information is always going to be placed there. One thing that many people have asked us about is about tickets for our cultural event on Saturday. This is going to be held at MAR, the Art Museum of Rio, one of the newest museums in Rio. And every person registered in Sibgrapi can buy a ticket at a very subsidized price. We have a few extra tickets available, but those must be purchased at a higher value. And this can be done during coffee breaks in the cultural center. So everyone, so persons who did not buy a ticket for the dinner, but still want to buy one, that's still time. And the people who want to bring along someone must buy an extra ticket so that he or she can be at this occasion. At this moment, I'd like also to introduce my two fellow members, and perhaps introduce myself, right? I'm Paulo César Carvalho and Moacir Silva. Moacir is one of the members, and most of you know Asla Sá. At this point, everyone knows that Asla is the soul of Sibgrapi 2014, and you can be sure that this would not be happening if it were not for her enormous effort to bring Sibgrapi to you at FGV. So we will be here all the time. So if you have any questions, you can ask us, and we are going to try to find someone who can answer most cases. Okay? So welcome to you all again, and I hope that we have a great Sibgrapi. Thank you. So I'd like to invite Hélio Lopes, who's the head of Sibgrapi, the Special Committee in Graphics and Image Processing of the Brazilian Society, the Brazilian Computer Society, to say a few words.
Thank you, Paulo. Good morning. On behalf of the Brazilian Computer Society, I'd like to welcome you all to this conference, and I'd like to thank the organizers, Paulo, Ashley, and Moacir, for holding this conference. That is a very, very, very big job to obtain the money and organize the space. So thank you very much for doing that. This is the 27th edition of the Sibgrapi, which is probably certainly the most important computer conference in Brazil, and it's probably the most important conference in America related to graphics, images, and patterns. So I would like also to thank the organizer, Diego, Anderson, Walter, and Derek for doing this great job of to maintain the high quality papers of here and for the presentation of this conference. And the effort was very big this year because we have several problems and in negotiations with Computer Graphics Forum, etc., IEEE. So thank you very much for doing that. It's the community, in the name of the community, I'd like to thank you for this, for doing this. Well, this year we will have we make a program in such a way that we could have a very long discussion about the future of the Sibgrapi. That will be done tomorrow at the evening. So please come here to discuss. I think that the community has to decide what we are going to do in the future. So I invite you all to come to the plenary meeting for tomorrow, 7 p.m. in this room. This will be a very important thing to do. Okay? So thank you all very much for doing this great job. And I pass the word to Anderson, one of the organized program chairs.
Good morning. Everybody prepared to start? Okay, I'll say a few words here in the name of the program committee to give you an idea of what Sibgrapi 2014 is, all right? So some fast facts about this year. The first thing is that this year, as you may know, we significantly increased the size of the program committee as one way of attracting more attention worldwide. It means that we invited researchers from all across the world, and the motivation was twofold. The first thing is that we wanted to ensure that individual program committee members would not get many papers to review. The idea was to give 2 papers, or 3 at most, for each person, and it happened. And the second is that we wanted to increase the international attention, awareness about Sibgrapi, and it happened. I was very happy to talk to my colleague Walter Shire, who said that in CVPR this year some people approached him to ask about this event, which is very interesting for us. We also have a new change this year. We changed it from the traditional GEMS submission system to CMT. And this was very important for attracting more program members from outside Brazil. CMT is way more known than GEMS and way easier to use. And also it's free. Completely free. Any problem that you have, Microsoft has some people to help you to solve it for free. And it has a nice policy to normalize the scores of the reviewers, so it's easy to find discrepancies between evaluations and to come up with the final decisions. So it's completely straightforward to use. When we started to organize Sibgrapi this year, we discovered that there was no complete list of people that attend and help Sibgrapi over the years. So we needed to compile several lists from different years. And right now we have more than 600 researchers in a pool to help Sibgrapi from Brazil and abroad. It's basically 350 from outside Brazil and the others from Brazil. And we invited all of them to be part of this year's Sibgrapi, and 271 accepted. We received 107 valid submissions. A valid submission is someone that registered a paper and indeed submit the PDF. Many times they just register and do not submit anything. So from what is valid, there's 107 submissions. Some papers received 3 reviews, but the most majority received 4 or 5. Some of you might know because you submitted the works. And also for the decision, we took in account the normalizing scores, which means that we evaluated if a paper received very discrepant evaluation. So a paper that's true accepts and true rejects needed special attention when being evaluated. In the end, we accepted 45 papers, and 62 were rejected. The acceptance rate of these years was 42%. And the nice thing is that due to an enormous work done by Asla and her group, all of the papers were able to be accommodated as oral talks without posters this year. As you know, the proceedings are in a nice USB drive with this logo from Sibgrapi, also Asla's idea. And every paper is indexed in IEEE Explorer. Also, very importantly, I'm very happy to announce that we have 4 very interesting keynote speakers this year. The first one is Tim over there, who will talk to us about computational analysis in cultural heritage applications. We also have a keynote about detectors and descriptors for 3-dimensional reconstruction of real scenes by Professor Mario Campos from UFMG, Brazil. Searching for images to measure the world from Robert Pless, Washington University in St. Louis, US. And finally, Deep Learning That Just Works by James Bergstra, University of Waterloo, Canada. So do not miss these incredible talks. Also of interest of this community, we worked hard to get 2 special issues attached to Sibgrapi. The first one is a special issue in Elsevier Computer and Graphics for the best papers in computer graphics. Those will be invited, and the deadline will be something like November or December. And this is a Qualis B1 top tier journal. And the vision and image processing machine learning papers will be invited to the special issue in Journal of Image and Video Processing, also Qualis B1. I have now a short video welcoming all of you to Rio. Some might have seen this video. Yeah, I'll talk about it. Yeah. I will show you a short video about Brazil. It's especially focused on people that are in Brazil for the first time, right? And also, Elio is just reminding me that we also have this year a special session for journal papers. This is a special section for interesting papers of computer and graphics. And do not miss it as well. It's in the program. So let's go to the video.
Did you hear that?
Brazil is calling you. Celebrate life here.
Asla, did I miss anything? Do you want to say any more information? No? Okay, so we just need a few minutes to get ready for the first invited session. Thank you.
Tem cabo que chega até ali mais perto?
Não.
Vou deixar o nome dele ali na frente, tá? Pode ser?
Yeah.
Can you prefer your water there or here?
Without this, yeah. Just rotate.
If you wanna hold on the, you don't need audio? Does it work? Is it trying to, yeah, it works. Que horas que
Essa sessão está marcada até o horas.
então a gente vai, ele vai terminar antes.
Eu vou abrir essa outra começa às 11. Então ela até vai terminar um pouquinho para dar tempo.
Hello, everyone. Is this working? All right. It is a pleasure to receive Tim Weyrich to FGV and to Sibgrapi. You guys can all read about Tim's work by Googling his name. So I'll talk about things that you can't find on Google. So I don't remember exactly when I met Tim. I know that the first time I met Tim's work was when I was a PhD student at Princeton, and there was this giant project of trying to scan human faces and get all the details, the reflectance properties of the human faces for performance, and it had this massive spherical gantry with a bunch of cameras connected together, and they were getting the geometry using some off-the-shelf 3D scanner. And I was at that time working on a project on how to combine normals and geometry, and it turned out that ended up being useful a little bit in this project, which was much bigger than the stuff I was doing. And so I went there. At that time, it was it was Merle, right? It was at Merle, yeah. So I went there, and I was really impressed first about the size of the project and the size of the challenge. And so later, sometime later, Tim actually came to Princeton to do a postdoc there, and then he started another massive project, which was this project about going to Santorini in Greece and scanning all the pieces of frescoes that had been destroyed by a volcano eruption, and now you just have to put these things back together. And so again, another gigantic project. Even before then, I was also impressed by a project that Tim did. So back in 2004, there was this new way of rendering geometry really fast, which was point-based rendering, and people like me were doing things with points. And Tim actually decided to build a hardware, like a graphics card that renders things based on this point-based paradigm. And so I think that the common theme here is something that I wish like everybody got in them. It's just this: be fearless. Like you see these giant projects that working on things that actually matter, things that have not only a very strong scientific and theoretical contribution, but a very big engineering contribution as well. And so so I would encourage you, even though Tim is going to talk today about cultural heritage related projects, he works on pretty much anything related to graphics. And so again, being fearless, and if you find a topic that you find is interesting, even though, like, don't stick to just one thing. Just try things in all areas that may interest you, and you may have you may be able to bring a fresh eye to the problem that people who have been working on the same area for a long time don't have. And so with that, without further ado, I welcome Tim.
Thank you very much. That was really a very nice and personal introduction, and I think there's much to it, to this kind of fearlessness, but I can only say that while you're inside such a project, you often wish you would have picked something smaller and something easier, right? So, especially for the PhD students amongst you, picking massively complex projects with large engineering components is a good recipe to extend the duration of your PhD, so make sure you've got funding, right? Other than that, it worked for me. I was successful with these crazy projects, and we're going to hear about two of them today. So, my presentation is about, well, I had to come up with a title about a year ago, right? And back then I said, okay, I'd like to talk about, the way how we make sense from cultural heritage data sets, basically, that we acquire in cultural heritage applications. But since then, I started shifting my focus a little bit and just realized the problem is often already at the part where we acquire data. It's not it's not a disjunct problem of what data you acquire, how you acquire it, and what you do with it in cultural heritage later on. So that's why I'd like to give that particular spin on the presentation today. It's also not intended to give, you know, a great cross-section about all the great things I've been doing. I just selected 2 projects to spend a little bit more time on them, to, you know, talk about the concepts that are close to my heart. So in general, acquisition of cultural heritage artifacts is one of the prime applications that come to mind if people hear, oh yeah, there's computer scientists that do something with archaeologists. Surely they must be scanning something. It's basically ingrained in our understanding of how engineers interact with the humanities. And I mean, it's a good thing that people are aware of these possibilities, and it's also a good thing that there's more and more projects that actually do something in the field. However, very often people basically approach this by saying, you know, let's just make sure we have a digital representation of the artifact that we care about. Let's just scan it so we have the data, and then we'll see what we can do with it, and something's going to come out of it. And that is partially driven by expectations that the digital data set can basically, to some extent, replace the original artifact. We call this the digital surrogate. The hope that once you have in the computer, you've basically saved it for eternity, and you don't have to care that much anymore about conservation of the original artifact, or the idea that you can actually transfer a data set across the Atlantic and you know, study it elsewhere, and you trust that the data is good enough so that a scholar, a humanities scholar, can learn everything they want to learn about the artifact by looking at the digital data set as opposed to the original. So there's all these kinds of expectations and assumptions in there when people decide to scan cultural heritage artifacts. However, there's a bit of a disconnect between the engineering reality. When, you know, if you're an engineer, somebody asks you, can you build me a scanner? If you're a good engineer, the first thing you ask back is, what kind of accuracy did you have in mind? Maybe the next thing you're going to ask is, how fast should the scanner be? What's my working volume? There are so many very technical, you know, rather boring constraints and requirements that can have a massive impact on what kind of system you're going to build and how you acquire the data. But the problem is that the people most of the people that are looking for cultural heritage data sets, they're not aware of all these technical trade-offs that have to be made. And that's why you more often than not end up with a data that is not really what you were looking for, and that is not really meeting the standards that you'd like to fulfill. And so the pitch that I'm going to make here, and it's running through the presentation, is essentially that it's critical to consider the ultimate destination of the data from the beginning on. You have to know what kind of research questions the humanities scholar has. What is it that they want to know about an artifact? And what is it that like to prefer to preserve? And more importantly, what is it that they don't care so much about? You have to find out these things right from the beginning, even before you plan any scanning activities, before you design any systems, before you think about how to represent your data. It sounds pretty obvious, but there's only a few people out there that really approach it that way. By the way, you find some good examples downstairs at the 3U CoForm exhibition. Maybe I should advertise them as well. So there's actually a special session just basically for investigating content. Right, but more often than not, people approach things in the following way. So acquiring data sets can be seen as a digital restoration or a digital preservation of the object. But the first thing that you should always do is do as much as you can physically. You should preserve the object as much as you can. Then, as you acquire data, you should really figure out what kind of data do you want to acquire. 3D reconstruction is not one generic thing. There's lots and lots of different algorithms that use different strong, more or less strong assumptions about the object reality when creating a 3D data set. And then people often trail off, because then they don't really know what to do with the data. Yeah? Somehow, surely it's going to be useful. Right. So my proposal is basically, from the beginning on, to focus on what data do you actually need based on the research questions. What quality do you need the data of? That's another thing that non-technical persons have often a very much difficulties to get at grips with. If you ask them how accurate should geometry be, and then they say, well, it should be accurate. I don't want to have errors in my system, right? Well, the good news is people get more and more accustomed to quality metrics when it comes to photographs and images. We're now living in a world where even non-technical people are dealing with images, and they can tell the difference between a 5-megapixel image and a 20-megapixel image. They might, ever since mobile phones entered the DPI war, many people in the meantime even can spot whether something is 300 DPI or 400 DPI. So we're living in a world where for 2D imagery, we reach the point that we can actually communicate what quality might mean, and you might get a sensible answer if you ask somebody what image resolution do you need of this document, for instance. But it becomes much more difficult when it comes to other aspects such as geometric accuracy. Do you want to have normal maps on an object? The notion that a normal map, even though it describes geometry, might be a separate thing that you might look at in terms of quality requirements, that you might look at separately rather than geometry, is something that is difficult to convey. When we're talking about creating systems that acquire data sets, then depending on the size of the task, you also have to care about usability, because it's not always going to be the technician and the engineer and the computer science professor who's going to do the acquisition and processing and so on. So usability makes a massive difference whether your system is a success or not. And ultimately, we have to start from the beginning on to think about scalability. We want to build systems that, if it works on 10 objects, I'd like to run 1,000 objects through it. And that's where most research prototypes, I dare say, fail. They provide, a certain proof of concept. They build systems that are only alive as long as the researchers are around, and they can't really go the next step of large scalability. And Fraunhofer was just making a massive effort in now finally creating a conveyor belt cultural heritage acquisition stage. I'm sure that many of you have seen it already. I think that is so far the only system out there that I'm aware of that tries to follow through with that promise of saying we solved the conceptual problems, and now here's the mass production pipeline. But there might be also a cost issue with that, so it's not suitable for every application. Right, so all of those things inform your system design, and depending on how you design your system, it even affects how you process your data, how you analyze it, and so on. Right, so without any more ado, I'm going to dive directly into 2 case studies in which I'm going to make this all a little bit more concrete. First, I'm going to talk about the digital reconstruction of the wall paintings at Akrotiri, and then a much more recent project, the digital restoration of the Great Parchment Book. So let's start with the Akrotiri wall paintings. Those wall paintings have been found on the island of Thera, it's modern-day in Santorini. It's in the middle of the Aegean Sea. Just realized, being in Southern America, I should probably also have had that arrow that points at Europe, Mediterranean, and so on, but I'll leave that to your imagination. So Santorini is essentially a volcano. It's a volcanic island. You can actually see it here. It's basically, here's the caldera of the volcano where the sea has flowed into the volcano. And it's actually one of the bigger, if not biggest, volcanoes in Europe. In ancient times, in late Bronze Age, there was a civilization, Minoan civilization on the island. And we know that it existed because there's lots of evidence that they traded with other civilizations in the Mediterranean. However, the civilization got pretty much wiped out when the volcano erupted. And since the late 60s, they are now excavating a city that has been buried under ashes by the volcanic eruption. And it's an extremely well state of preservation. So the ashes really preserved all the materials and everything that's inside there. One of the most exciting finds on that excavation are the wall paintings. The civilization there, they covered most of the interior walls of the buildings with very, very beautiful iconography and paintings. And the material is extremely well preserved and so on. But there's a catch. Prior to the volcanic eruption, there was an earthquake. And during the earthquake, the wall paintings detached from the walls, fell onto the floor, shattered into multiple pieces. You have, make no mistake, if you hear late Bronze Age, it's, those weren't cave dwellers. They had multi-story buildings, and those buildings started collapsing in the earthquake. So you have now multiple floors of debris mixed in together with lots and lots of different fragments of different frescoes. If you find two fragments next to each other, it's not even clear that they belong to the same fresco. So that's the real problem that they're encountering now. And it's a real laborious process. It's a manual process to reassemble them. This is what they've been basically working on since the late 60s, and they're still busy with that. They've got storerooms and storerooms full of these fresco fragments, and they estimate that they're going to take another 150 years to assemble everything that they have in stock. So the obvious idea is, why don't we use computers? Because computers are fast. We can surely speed this up. Right. So that was that naive, simple thought that somebody had in 2006, and then he approached Simon Sienkiewicz and me at Princeton University and said, you guys know something about computers, and surely scanners can help, and the computer does the rest afterwards. It's such an obvious thought, so let's do it. Well, we did have respect of the we basically mulled over it for a few weeks until we decided, okay, let's give it a shot, because I was trying to use a negative term, but let's say we were fearless, as Diego said, and went into it anyway. So we started with a team of some professors. I was a postdoc back then, and a couple of PhD students there. A note, there is a local on here. And we worked with the Akrotiri excavation to find out how to best help them. Ever since, there's been a couple of permutations. People changed affiliations, moved around the globe. Again, all that started in late 2006. The current snapshot looks roughly like this. This is all a gross simplification. It's been the longest project I've been ever involved in. And I think the interesting fun fact about this, it's also the least funded project I was ever part of. We figured if we want to have a computer-aided solution, we need to really study the problem. So we created a grad student seminar in Princeton then in spring 2007, where we put a lot of students together, and we all speculated on how the problem could be solved and so on. We learned about the nature of plaster. These frescoes, these wall paintings were painted onto plaster. We painted our own frescoes. We destroyed them. And that way basically created some nice data sets. However, we had also help from the Akrotiri excavation themselves. The conservators at Akrotiri created a fake fresco for us. Well, it wasn't even that much fake. They created it exactly the same way how people did it in late Bronze Age, using the same materials, the same soil, everything. Painted something in a similar style as you have in the original paintings, then broke everything, shattered it into pieces, buried it in the ground, covered it with soil, dug it up again, threw away half of the pieces. It was very realistic, really, and then sent to us the remaining pieces and said well, we can do something with it. And we had this great plan of building this computer system that eventually just tells us how the pieces go together, and we said we're not going to try it ourselves. Unfortunately, we left that box in the lab overnight, and there was the student not related to the project that saw it and just felt, whoa, it's a jigsaw puzzle. So on the next morning, it was already assembled. The student had a job offer from the head of the fresco laboratory. He preferred to stay at Princeton and graduate. But that meant we had immediately also a ground truth that we could then use in further experiments. So that's how it all started. Obviously, we also needed to have a field trip, and see, here's a very happy Diego. Those were the times. So, well, I'm showing this not just for funs and giggles. The thing is, we were wise enough to basically say, all this kind of preparatory work that we did with the grad student seminar and so on, that only goes so long. In the end, we really need to find out how they approach the problem and how they're working. And in the end, we, slight anecdote at the side, it turned out they wouldn't actually have worked with us if we wouldn't have spent the first day with them just listening and not telling them how great computer science is and what we can do. They actually had their own prejudices against computer scientists, and if you ever work with cultural heritage partners, make sure to first listen before you tell them how great computers are and graphics and so on. So we, had a lot of in-depth discussions with the archaeologists and conservators, which required interpreters because hardly any of them spoke English, and but that can be overcome. And it really, we figured language barriers, well, they can complicate things a bit, but if everyone's determined, there's no real problem. So we learned about the existing process. We then eventually proposed some solution approaches. And we learned very quickly that we have to focus on usability because the system would be employed on-site. So untrained conservators would be able to use it, interns and so on. And what's most important, you cannot walk into basically into a running operation like the Akrotiri fresco laboratory and just say, all right, we're going to change everything. You have to find ways how to integrate your system into the existing workflow. So what we learned is the way that they're organizing the fragments is roughly by location where they've been found. There's a lot of handwritten documentation in Greek, and there's hardly anything digitized. There's no database. I don't know. I had this kind of expectation. I thought if I'm entering a lab that is a massive operation with various things, I was expecting them to have a computer database where they've been logging various things and so on and so on. But no. It's just eventually we had to assign individual numbers to each fragment because if you have them in a computer, that's what you need to do. They were aghast. They thought, what a waste. It's putting effort in numbering individual fragments. They never cared about the fragments once they were glued together, right? It's all about finding matches, about piecing things together, and then moving on. There's no need to dwell on an individual fragment. That is a little bit different to how many other conservators think in other domains, but in their case, it just had so many fragments that would have been a luxury. The individual fragments are being stabilized, so clean, stabilized, and so on. And ultimately, here's a bit of a visualization of the nature of the problem. So I would say this fragment is probably a centimeter in length. So lots and lots of little pieces of rubble, many pieces. They've got a whole lab full with tables that are filled with such fragments. So that's the magnitude of the problem. The way they identify pairwise matches, which is the first step of assembling something, is by putting them together physically and seeing whether whether that interface interlocks and whether they basically feel it. Just as there's many other criteria, something might look like a match, but unless you put them together and move them against each other and feel how the pieces interlock, you're not really sure that that's a match. However, you can't really try every possible fragment pair at every possible orientation by hand. So the conservatives do like what every good jigsaw player does. You start, organizing your fragments. You think, you put all the blue sky pieces over there and everything that isn't close to a boundary over there, and you try to come up with heuristics, what pieces to try with each other. And the conservatives are basing those on fragment characteristics. So the characteristics that they care about are the size and thickness of fragments, because the mud brick walls that the frescoes were attached to, they're fairly undulating, but the surface of the fresco is really nice and smooth and even. But that means that basically the thickness of the plaster follows the unevenness of the wall behind it. And two fragments that are next to each other are very likely to have a compatible thickness. So that's a very strong criterion. The level of erosion is important. You might wonder, why would that tell me something about compatibility between fragments? Because they might end up in very different places and be very differently eroded. But the thing is, most of the damage that you see was not after the earthquake and the eruption. It was actually prior to that. It's easy to forget that, we think that cultural artifacts, they are, completely pristine until something bad happens, and then we have to recover this original state. But the thing is, the state before something happens of an everyday item will always show, slight damage and marks of use and so on. So there's erosion marks on frescoes, and they could partially be because of floodings of the buildings. It could even be that somebody was just mopping the floor regularly, and every time, damaging the fresco a little bit further. So that's why the compatible level of erosion is telling you something about compatibility between fragments. Discoloration and color can be a criterion, but this is here you see an example how something that you might find an obvious criterion where the two things go together can be misleading, because what you see here is actually a partially assembled part of the iconography, and you can see that those pieces have a very different discoloration than here, and that is basically damage that happened after the eruption as things were embedded. So there's nothing to be certain about with these fragments. The set of pigments being used, slight undulations, imperfections in the flatness of the fresco are indications, and the texture of the back. So now that we basically, oh yes, and there's another thing. You have things like string impressions. When they wanted to create a very straight line, they did something that every mason still does nowadays. You take a string, you span it, you keep it really, really taut, and then you take it and you flick it against the wall, and that leaves an imprint of the string. And people in the late Bronze Age had figured out the same method already, and you can see here, for instance, the mark that a string has left in the plaster. So all of those are things that the conservators care about. None of them said, oh, I care about the entirety of the fresco fragment, they weren't really interested in a 3D data set or so. It's all about having the information that you need to identify matches. So we tried to distill all these criteria into a few quality metrics and criteria. So for instance, we determined that we need some fairly accurate 3D geometry, but only down to maybe a 1/4 millimeter resolution. What we do care about is color on the front, because that's where the painting is, that's where the iconography is. And in order to pick up things like these string impressions and erosion and so on, we also care about fine geometric detail on the front surface, nowhere else, just on the front surface. And that translates, with a roughly flat fragment, translates pretty much to a normal map. So those 3 data modalities basically cover pretty much all of these characteristics that they talked about. Having identified that allows us then to cut corners. So, for instance, instead of going for very high quality industry grade 3D scanner, we were able to go with a very cheap off-the-shelf scanner. This scanner, I think it still sells for about $2,000. I know it's not nothing, but as far as commercial 3D scanners come, it's the next more expensive scanner is about one order of magnitude more expensive. So that scanner is actually very cheap. It has a fairly good geometric resolution, but obviously they had to make some compromises in designing it, and it has actually very, very bad color reproduction, and it's slow. It's incredibly slow, which is partially also due to the software. So the thing is, we don't care about color at that point. That's what we just said. We don't need surround color reconstruction of an object, so that's fine enough. And we overcame the software problems by reverse engineering the scanner and just writing our own USB drivers and talking about fearless approaches. That was Simon's achievement, but there's some parallels there. Good. In terms of high quality color of the front, well, there's existing devices out there that are specialized on creating high resolution color reproductions of flat objects, and they're called 2D flatbed scanners. You find them in every office, and they're dirt cheap, and they give us 600 dpi reconstruction of the colors of the front of a fresco. It's not super spectrally calibrated and so on, but again, that's not something anyone was asking for. We need to know what is being depicted and so on. So that thing does the job. We even found a way to reconstruct normal maps using a flatbed scanner. So what we're exploiting is the fact that in a flatbed scanner, this linear light source that you see traveling along is slightly displaced relative to the linear image sensor, basically the kind of linear camera that runs alongside with the light source. You couldn't put them in front of each other because one would shadow the other. So there's always going to be a slight displacement between that light source and the camera, or the CCD element. But that means that any surface point that is being imaged is actually lit under a slight angle. And you can exploit that by scanning each fresco fragment 4 times, and each time rotating it by 90 degrees. So you've got 4 scans of each fragment, and each time, because of that rotation, each surface point is lit under a different angle. And many of you will already think, oh, photometric stereo, and it's also written on the slides. So that's then basically what we're doing. The only catch is things become much more complicated if you use linear light sources. Photometric stereo is great, it's mathematically elegant and so on, as long as your light source is a point light source. If you have a linear light source, your basically reflections function becomes a fairly nasty integral, and so it needs some extra work. But the upshot is it gives us, again, 600 dpi normal maps of a surface at a very, very high scanning rate. So we made sure that the whole data processing pipeline is fully automated. Fully automated scan alignment and scan cleaning is, feel free to disagree, but I would say it's still a bit of a holy grail. It's not something for a generic scanner, for a generic scanning setup, generic procedure. You will always need that human operator that's correcting errors, there's pre-aligning range maps, operating within 3D interfaces. Now that is something we knew the conservators couldn't do. They, when we presented them with a 3D trackball interface, that was already a bit of a challenge. However, we know so much about the artifacts that we're scanning. There's thousands of them, but they all have, for instance, a flat front surface. And we've been incorporating that knowledge into the scanning protocol. We said, first put a face down with the flat surface down, next put it down with a flat surface up, take an exact number of scans with a very fixed scanning geometry. So you see we lock down the scanner in a specific frame. So if you incorporate all these hard constraints, you can then basically write a custom processing pipeline that is much more stable and doesn't need interaction. And that's actually what worked out pretty nicely. we had something like a 1% error rate in one part of the processing pipeline. In the cases where something went wrong, instead of writing complicated software to fix these errors, we told people, you know, just scan that fragment again, just do it again. Which, for an operation of that size, makes much more sense than complicating the interface. So that led to high usability, and in the end, again, to high throughput. So the system, as I described it so far, was fully accepted by the team at Akrotiri. They loved it. It did require, in terms of, you know, software interface, it required very minimal user interaction. Most of it was automated. It never took us longer than 30 minutes to train somebody in, you know, how to do the 3D scanning, the 2D scanning, the processing, the validation of the data, everything. For most people, it took, you know, less than 20 minutes. So that was another sign of success. And overall, the throughput is about 10 fragments per hour. You could easily scale that by buying additional scanners, but even with a single scanner, that is somewhat a respectable size. Okay, for some it may not sound like a lot, but if you've ever scanned a 3D object, just the acquisition process itself easily takes, you know, 10, 20 minutes, and then you spend a lot of time with the data afterwards, and it's, you know, trust me, 10 fragments per hour is a high throughput. Right. We then spent a few years on developing unsupervised algorithms that try to, you know, find matches, and that I'm not going to go into that. It's going to take too long. But I'm happy to answer more questions on our strategies here. Our strategies involve geometric features, features of the, you know, color statistics on the surface. We basically end up with a very large probabilistic framework that gives us likelihoods that two fragments go together at a certain accuracy. And so those are actually amongst the very first pairings that we found using the system. Until now, well, let's say the latest iteration of the system is actually as good, that well, it basically finds a lot of matches that the conservators also find in their manual process. There are some matches that were only found by the computer, but there's a pretty much identical proportion of matches that were found by the conservators, but not by the computer. So overall, we feel that entitles us to say the system is now as good as a conservator on the ground, and possibly faster. However, we're not content yet, because we'd like to find these additional matches that were found by the conservators only. Well, the thing is, when we went back to the match proposals that our automated system was creating, we figured those matches actually have been proposed. They were just proposed with maybe a 5% likelihood that they'd be a match. Which means if you have 20 of these low likelihood suggestions, there might be one that is actually a match. The only problem is we couldn't possibly send these suggestions to the conservators. So the way it currently works is we basically have a printout of how the match looks like and list the specific numbers and where the fragments are to be found. We send that to the conservators on site via email, and then they get back to us and say, yeah, it's a match, it's a match. However, if they have to go through 19 matches without any experience of success, they're going to drop this. Then you say, we don't have time for that. So this is a real problem. So the way we're currently approaching this is we figured there is certain visualizations that we can use to pre-visualize the quality of a match suggestion. So the most successful one was actually a proximity map. It's a false colored image that shows you how large is the gap between two fragments. And looking at that, a human operator can come up with a fairly good guess whether something's a match or not. The only problem is you'd have to go through tens of thousands of those, and it's going to take many, many months. So a colleague of mine went through the first 10,000 match suggestions, which took him something like 3 weeks, and he found many matches that were then confirmed by the conservators, but that's not sustainable. So the solution is, and here's a shameless advertisement, whoa, I skipped it. Whoa. Okay, long story short, we are soon launching a crowdsourcing computer game for iPhones, where you can download individual match suggestions and then give us your opinion on whether something's a match or not. We have, in a first pilot study, we had basically good evidence that people, even if they don't know anything about fragments, if they don't even have a good explanation of what how these proximity maps are really computed and what they should be looking for, but just playing this for a couple of times, they get gradually better at gauging whether something's a match or not. So we really hope that by using thousands of users, we may be able to finally defeat the conservators in how good we can reassemble frescoes. So, in summary, this system is an end-to-end system that was really designed to directly interface with the restoration process. The key design decisions that made it possible were to only acquire data that is directly related to the matching process, to have strict control over how these things are being scanned in the whole workflow, which allowed us these automated pipelines, and ultimately really balancing automatism against interaction. And that basically led ultimately to a low-cost design that scaled well, and if you've got a problem that contains so many fragments, scalability is the real issue. Okay, so that was project number 1. How much time do we have? 10 minutes? 15? No, actually, 40. Right, 40 minutes.
Yeah, but the session starts at 11.
Okay, 30 minutes, yeah. Okay, that's very comfortable, thank you. I just got a bit of a shock here. Right, so the second project that we conducted with a fairly similar approach, but in a completely different context, is about the reconstruction, digital restoration of the Great Parchment Book. The Great Parchment Book, that's actually the short form. It's called the Great Parchment Book of the Honourable the Irish Society of Northern Ireland, and I think that's where I'm trailing off. It's got a longer title. It turns out it's a 17th century doomsday book, which means it's a book that basically reflected at that time the way how property was distributed in the Irish country of Derry in Northern Ireland. So it was a book that really described that piece of land belongs to that person, and he got it from that other person after they split it over here, and it's basically a historic document that tells you exactly how not only property but also power was distributed in Northern Ireland. And the reason why that book is of such historic value, it's basically the last snapshot of Northern Ireland before the British Crown invaded and occupied it. So it's not entirely without political political potential here. The book was fired then in the was damaged in the 18th century during a fire. It didn't really burn. Parchment doesn't burn easily. It's not like paper, and it was encased in a wooden box during the fire. And that's where it was damaged. But the problem is, while parchment doesn't easily burn, it starts shriveling under heat because it's animal hide. It basically does the same that your hair does if you get too close to a candle. It starts curling, shriveling, and shrinking. And it does so quite unevenly and very much dependent on how the heat was distributed, how the fibers in the parchment were distributed, and so on. So it's very difficult to predict how parchment is going to react on heat. And in the state that was left, the parchment was, well, people just wouldn't let anyone read it, essentially. And it's a book of 160 folios, so it's about 320 pages. That is really, I mean, this is not made up. This is how it's been stored for many, many years. And they also call it the Poppedom manuscript because, you know, this Indian Poppedom things that if you put them on a table, they make exactly like these parchments. So that's where the name came from. And we got basically involved in a great push where they said, we want to make this parchment accessible to the public. That involved putting some more effort in the physical restoration, but then the hope was basically that we could just basically image everything and digitally restore things, in particular digitally flattening these shriveled and shrunken parchments. So the generic approach was, yeah, let's do some physical restoration, and then let's use a imaging procedure, and we get a 3D model, and then we use it somehow. Looks familiar? Well, there's nothing wrong with approaching it as as a very first approximation. You just have to be aware that how many implicit assumptions in that kind of generic pipeline are. So if we say do something, yeah, we from the beginning on we wanted to flatten it because somewhat we assumed that's what restores the document. Then we did the right thing. We spent a lot of time with people at the London Metropolitan Archives, where the parchment is stored, and also the institution that funded it, and let them explain to us what their exact goals are. And what really transpired was that almost the only thing that they cared about was to be able to transcribe the text. Transcription meaning, producing an ASCII, or it's typically what you use is an XML subset called TEI. They wanted somebody to just basically read the text and transcribe it into this digital form manually, so that afterwards you can display the content online, you can do analyses of the text and so on. So that was the only thing that they were really interested in. And then, yes, of course, they said it'd be nice to have a nice flat depiction that you could show to somebody and say, look, this is how the pages looked like. But that came far after the transcription requirement. And what they were definitely not interested in, and I was deeply disappointed about that, was recovering reflectance properties of these parchments and seeing how the special anisotropic sheen is caused by the individual fibers of the parchment, scattering properties, all of that. Not interested. Okay, so that simplified things a bit. They also said, multispectral imaging, which is, I guess, the other thing. If somebody hears, okay, document reconstruction, it's like a knee-jerk reaction to think, oh, we need multispectral imaging. Well, multispectral imaging is a very powerful tool for various kinds of analyses to extract hidden information. For instance, if you're having a palimpsest and you try to read what's underneath there, then that's becoming interesting. But there were, as far as people studied these parchments so far, they were convinced that those weren't palimpsests, because people haven't run out of space yet in this book. If they needed to have an amendment, they just wrote it in the back. It's in many ways, this is a very administrative document. It's a boring document, and people had plenty of parchment. There's no palimpsest. Also, there were no interesting things to be found out about the inks, because they knew there's two inks that they used in that century, and you can find both of them on the parchment. And yeah, that is that. Right? So I don't want to diss multispectral imaging here. It's a great tool. Just know what you apply it to. And that wasn't the right moment in time to apply it, especially if you have that vast amount of pages to deal with. So that simplified matters again, and we soon then got access to some first gently restored pages. So they started by physically restoring them as much as they could. The key method was to humidify the parchment, because then it softens. But then you have to be very, very careful. You can't, just stretch it into shape, because it's going to rupture and damage. So basically, they humidified it and then let gravity do its job. Just let it zag a little bit, and that was the main trick. But even so, there's some very serious deformations that remained. So those are not examples that are chosen because they were particularly bad. That's actually pretty representative how some parts of the parchment look like. And you see there's some nooks and crannies and valleys where you really have to walk around the parchment, look from various angles to see any bits of the writing. It's not a good shape to give it to a historian to transcribe it. So that's when we basically took over. That's when the digital restoration came in. So, right, we said, let's do imaging, reconstruct, and digital flattening. So that does sound good. So we've initially tried some fancier methods, but eventually we figured that what you're seeing here is the most suitable reconstruction method for these parchments. It's called structure from motion. It's been, as far as I know, about a year ago, suddenly everyone woke up to the fact that these algorithms exist. You take lots of images, you throw them into a bundle adjustment and patch-based stereo reconstruction method, and you get a 3D model. So, okay, that's going to be the second time I'm going to advertise the work of 3D Coform. Those guys even put a service online where you can upload such image collections and you get a 3D data set back. And many people are using that. Well, in our case, we tried it. But the thing is, that, including other standard pipelines, they didn't meet our resolution requirements because we need some really, really high resolution, basically insanely high texture resolution for every parchment. So we had to stipple together our own reconstruction pipeline. Well, the images that this is, yeah, by the way, this is the PhD work by my student Kazim, who actually did what he's doing here for all 320 pages. We had to interrupt at some point because despite he's pretty buffed up, but still he developed back problems, so those cameras are heavy. So it looks easy, it sounds easy, but I should probably really also say how much, how much effort, physical effort the student had to go through. So that image set is a representative set, how you would picture a single page of a parchment. And the 3D reconstructions that you get look roughly like that. So that's a point cloud, that's a Poisson reconstruction. And then we use some image-based, some view-dependent texturing to create a really, really high-resolution texture of that. So the next thing is flattening it, because that's what we've all been waiting for. And if you're a computer scientist and you think about how to flatten a 2D manifold that's been wrinkled and so on, you very quickly make the connection that you say, oh, this is a surface parameterization problem. It's basically the identical problem if you wanted to texture map a 3D object and you'd like to find a good mapping of texture UV coordinates onto your object. And typically if you try to create such a UV mapping, you're interested in stretch minimal mappings. You'd like to create content in the texture domain, and you want to make sure that there aren't some parts of the texture that end up very, very small on the 3D objects and others are blown up. So that's what stretch optimal texture parameterizations achieve. So that's just the right tool that we need here, essentially. If you have a mapping of a 2D domain onto this wrinkled surface, it's a good assumption of how to unwarp this geometry in a stretch minimal way. In fact, it's, you can mathematically prove that it's stretch minimal if you follow that procedure. However, if you do that, you end up with reconstructions that look like that. So I should say this is actual 3D geometry with texture on top. Those are completely flat versions. They still look wrinkled because we haven't removed the shading. Right, so the shading is still baked in, so it looks like geometry, but it's actually flat. But if you look closely, you can actually see that things became worse than they were before. In particular, there are some parts where text is squeezed down to a very, very small size, and in other areas, they're much larger, and you still get holes gaping and so on. So why does this nice mathematical framework not apply? Well, it makes the assumption that what you're flattening is a homogeneous material that behaves, I don't know, like a soap bubble surface or like a piece of like a rubber sheet, and none of these assumptions apply to parchments. And I told you in the beginning, parchment is made of animal hide. It's a natural product. If the animal that the parchment's been made for had a scar, that's going to lock down many parts of the distortion of the warp during fire. It's very, very hard to predict how it actually warped. So that's the real problem. So let's revisit the whole flattening problem. I made the connection to texture mapping, but there is another much more historical connection, which is to map making. Whenever you're trying to get the spherical shape of the Earth mapped to a 2D map, you have to find a way to do this in the least distortive way. And despite many, many works on how to map the world onto a 2D plane, the best possible way of depicting the world is still the globe. Just don't flatten it. represent your map on a geometry that is the geometry as you found it. Well, in our case, well, yeah, okay, and in the digital age, sorry, I'm too far away from the receiver. In the digital age, the equivalent of a globe is arguably Google Earth. Now, what Google Earth essentially does is it's got a camera that is just flying across the surface of the globe, and as you zoom in, you can see basically the footprint of the viewport. As you zoom in, the distortions of the viewport get minimal, and as you zoom out, you get some distortion in the corners. But because you're using a camera that adaptively reprojects the globe depending on your current viewpoint, you always get an optimal depiction of this originally spherical surface. Right, so let's do that for parchments. Here it is. This is an interactive parchment viewer. You can move the camera across the parchment surface. You can zoom in, zoom out. That corresponds to getting the camera close up or moving it away. And at all times, you see only a small portion of the parchment. And by making sure that the camera always looks orthogonally onto the parchment, you already get rid of various degrees of confusion and distortion. But what you can then do is you can take a local environment around that view frustum and apply stretch minimal texture parameterization on that. If you keep this local, all these artifacts that I showed you earlier about some areas becoming too small, others too large, other distortions, for a local environment, those artifacts are very small. So that's why it becomes possible to have a viewer like this. So this is now from the perspective of the, whoa, I need a new clicker. So this is from the perspective of the camera. And you can see you navigate across the surface, and whenever the camera stops, we run this local surface parameterization and unwarp the parchment around that camera view. The conservators, well, the archivists and the transcribers loved it because it's very close to how they would already decipher a document. If it wasn't that precious, if it was possible to handle it, the transcriber would arguably sit there with a lamp and just move that parchment around and basically emulate what we've been doing with that camera. So it's quite fun to see how with a very different path of reasoning, we ended up with a solution that was very close to general practice. Other things that transcribers care about is documenting the digital provenance of what they're looking at. So every now and then they might come across something that looks implausible. So here within that ellipse, you see something that looks like smudges, or it doesn't looks more like a texture blending artifact rather than original text. So what we can do is we can pick the closest input image, closest to the view, and apply some affine correction to it so that it really matches that input view, and we can display it here. And as you can see in this photograph, that these scribbles were actually genuine. They're not part of an artifact. There might be other areas in which it looks like you lost resolution because of this looks like there haven't been enough camera observation, so you have low quality texture here. If you then retrieve the original input image, you can still see text here. Yeah? So with those features together, we basically said, all right, we didn't really digitally flatten entire documents. What we created was an interactive viewer, but that's just perfect for transcription. So that's what I meant, keep an open mind about the goals that you set in these projects. However, we still wanted to digitally flatten it. There are still applications for that. If you'd like to depict the parchment in a book, for instance, you'd like to have a 2D version. So what we developed was basically an interactive system that allows us to estimate how the deformation varied across the surface. And the way it works is that we basically annotate features on the page of which we know how they should look like. So for instance, lines, text lines, they should be straight. And you can actually tell sometimes these pages even have rulings. You can see that people often, started making lines with a ruler and then wrote on top of it. So it was quite a neat document. So it's a good assumption to say lines need to be mapped to something straight. Detecting them automatically, we tried that too, is a bit tricky because it's handwritten text and there's swooshes and swishes at the end of words. It makes it difficult. But in a semi-automatic system, it can be done. The other cue that we used is we tried to extract font size, in a sense. So basically the size and height of characters, assuming that the text size should be homogeneous across the document as well. Developing a full optical character recognition system for that kind of handwriting would have been prohibitive, but we identified a small number of glyphs that were very repeatable and showed very little variation, such as lowercase a, for instance. So what we do is we do some pattern matching. We try to find all occurrences of a lowercase a, and we infer from that the local size and also anisotropic deformation of the text. And that information allows us to create basically a blending field of how the deformation varied across the surface. So what you see here are a couple of these automatically detected lowercase a's. Here the user can annotate by detecting some lowercase a's themselves and also basically giving an indication of the size and the aspect ratio. Here you're seeing the tool where we're tracing lines. So the computer makes suggestions, and you see here it's been thrown off by these additional descenders and ascenders of the text. So with a single click, you can basically direct it back onto the line, and it completes the line. So it takes about 5 minutes to annotate a page like you see it here, and that is sufficient to reconstruct a tangent field across the surface, which expresses how expresses how the warp looks like. And then you can unwarp it, and you see this here. Yeah? So those are now completely flattened parchments. Yeah, during that morph, we're finally removing discolorations and shading as well. That's why it also looks quite nice. Yeah, we have many more parchments, but I'll just leave it at them. Again, we had so much material, we couldn't even be bothered by hand picking anything. So all the examples you've seen here were just fairly representative for the parchments we had. So that means we also, ticked off the digital flattening aspect, and that can be used for 2D archival. So in summary, we were able to use a lightweight acquisition procedure. And again, we've been only acquiring what we needed. We resisted the temptation to do multispectral imaging. It's not for lack of equipment. We have it. It's just, yeah, it doesn't really serve the purpose. We developed a specialized viewer that really tries to tell you as much as you can about the original artifact. So there's many instances in which now people at the London Metropolitan Archives prefer this interactive viewer over the 2D flattened version because it's basically less processed. If you transcribe the content, you'd like to be as close as possible to the original state. In particular, these tricks of removing shading and discoloration is something that can also be counterproductive, because in transcribing you'd like to be able to judge the degree of damage or what kind of damage there is, because that might actually help you disambiguating something where you don't really know what the text actually says. Right, and then there's this interactive flattening tool for 2D archival. So we did, I thought I fixed this. It's not imminent. The source code is actually out in the open. Everyone can download it, play with the pipeline. We're currently also working on some end-user documentation and tutorials, because so far, it needs to be people like you to actually make any sense from the software, and the average archivist wouldn't be able to do it. That is the URL. Anyone who would like to take notes, but you'll find also the respective links on my homepage. So We have, in parallel, also conducted some studies that to see how does parchment actually get into the shape that we found it in. So London Metropolitan Archives kindly provided us with some 250-year-old parchments that we were allowed to cut up into little pieces and swatches and then subject to very controlled damage. So we took some pieces and heated them up at different temperatures. We did other pieces of parchment and spilled wine over them, or vinegar, or blood. I mean, those are actually representative of the kind of damage that you find in various documents, right? And then after each form of damage, well, actually before we damaged the piece of parchment, we did multispectral images of it, and afterwards as well. And we now have a really nice database of damaged parchments before and after, and we're currently trying to see whether we can learn something from it, so that we can, the more we know about how the damage establishes itself, the higher the likelihood that we can invert it in a sense. So that's one thing we're currently doing in that area. So to conclude, the two projects I've showed, they were meant to make a case about, you know, custom optimized system design and cultural heritage. There is a real case to be made for that kind of custom design. Not everything can be, I mean, I think both projects would have been impossible if you only would have taken off-the-shelf components, even if money wouldn't have been an objection, right? So I think both make a case that you need custom design. However, custom design is extremely implementation heavy. So the forward-looking question is, how can we start building such systems in a more modular way so that people can reuse solutions? And I think one example was this structure from motion pipeline. So we've been making heavily use of other people's source code. There was Bundler, PMBS. That allowed us to whip up such pipeline. But we need these kinds of efforts also on many other fronts. Then designing such a system does actually require you to talk to non-engineers. It really, well, it needs people on both sides of the disciplines that go the extra mile and make the extra effort of developing an understanding for the other fields world. And you'll find very few teams that have that kind of combined knowledge in-house, so it really requires stepping out of the office. And one thing that I found throughout all these projects, recurring issue, is as much work that you have to put into the technical implementations, you almost have to say put the same amount of effort and well, in how to communicate what you've been doing, to give people an idea of what the nature of the data is that you created, for instance. Or if you're asking tricky questions about, are you interested in this, are you interested in that, what kind of quality do you need, and so on, you need to some extent to communicate what the technical implications of that would be. And more often than not, you end up in a situation where you're tempted to give people a lecture in computer science in the hope that you can bring them up to speed, but then you realize, no, that's not the solution. I think what we need is a good vocabulary. As the example that I said in the beginning, DPI is a good concept to qualify 2D content, and it's a concept that many people are familiar with so far, but once you enter 3D data sets, multispectral data sets, and so on, we still haven't really developed this joint intuitive language to talk to each other efficiently. So it's establishing such a language, but also quantitative measures to express the nature of cultural heritage data sets is, in my view, the next challenge that we should tackle. Open sourcing of modular solutions, as I said, there's some prominent examples, especially when it comes to the, once you have data, there is a great tool, the Mesh Lab out there that is pretty much the industry standard in the meantime, that allows you to operate with such objects. But we need more such solutions also on the acquisition and processing side. And finally, the question is, how do you retain the know-how to run these systems? So even if it's modular, you need at least a lot of know-how to design such a system. The question is, how do you retain that know-how? And it cannot be that it stays, let's say, within academic groups where PhD students come in and move out and take the know-how with them. I really hope that maybe on the basis of some small, medium enterprises, that an industry is developing that, you know, as a service provides know-how around these problems and is assisting in creating prototypical solutions. So that's so far my pitch. There's obviously many people that need to be thanked. I believe it's fairly complete, but anyone who misses his name on there, let me know. I'm open for questions, but we have to keep it, I guess, to about 5 minutes so that we can switch into the next session. Is that right? Okay, good.
Okay. Thank you for the talk, team. It's really great. I have a more generic and a specific technical question. The generic question is about a more generic system, because I mean these are really great work. I mean, and we've done some similar specific work here, which really needs tailored and custom systems. But I've talked with lots of people from museums here and from the cultural background, and one of their hopes or worries is about exhibition to the general public. That's one of the things they strive for, like to have the cultural heritage and in a way that most people can access it. They have this worry, right? And in Brazil, it's kind of hard because we have like many thousands of kilometers between towns and museums. They always ask, is it possible to have a system be low cost enough and like a vision system robust enough so people can just use it, get a video camera, scan something, and then in some way exhibit to the public? How far are we from this kind of system?
The thing is, for most, let's say for about half the materials that you'd find with cultural heritage artifacts, they are pretty well behaved that if you have a high enough resolution camera, you can just take lots of images, create some geometry reconstruction from it. So these pipelines start existing. However, it really depends on the artifact. You often start hitting then resolution issues. And you know, sometimes, from having talked to museums curators, sometimes they are more afraid of a 3D reconstruction leaving out interesting detail. Or let's say if your reconstruction pipeline over smoothes your data, then they're worried that that gives people the impression that that's how the artifact looked like. But in reality, it had all these fine little detail that got lost. So in those cases, people would almost prefer in those cases, people would then often prefer a higher resolution photograph taken in a professional photo studio. So it's really a quality issue. And especially if you move into difficult materials, highly specular materials, refractive materials, textiles, basically there are heavily specialized individual solutions to acquire individual aspects of that reflectance, for instance. But they're not generic anymore. And creating that massive system that scans every possible aspect at the very high quality is still out of reach at this point for low budget operations. Yeah. Okay.
Hi Tim, David Arnold. Thanks for the plugs to 3D Coform. I clearly agree with a huge amount of what you said. The only slight area in which I think there's more of a responsibility on the technologists is actually to think through what the second question is. Not, you know, because if you concentrate on collecting the data that satisfies the current expectations, the next thing that inevitably happens is the cultural heritage professional thinks of another question, and you may or may not have the data in place to do it.
That's right. That's right. That's actually a very good point. It really should have included it there. You try. I mean, we tried at all times to, make sure that if we feel there is basically a low-hanging fruit, if you just acquire that and that in addition, then once the project is over, you can tell the conservators, look, we've got there's more things you can do with it. It's very difficult, though, to really hedge against the possibility of the archivist turning around and then saying, oh, okay, now let's ask that question or look into those material properties, for instance, and so on. You can't really hedge against all of that. So the way I see it, it is part of your very first explorative meetings with the humanities scholars, that you have to basically be very clear about what they're losing based on the things that they're not getting, right? In the end, the technical compromise that's being reached with a custom acquisition pipeline has to be carried by both the humanities scholars and the engineers, and you have to make sure that both sides make a well-informed decision, and it's got a lot to do with expectation management as well, right? So that's my take on it, and there is definitely a responsibility with the engineer on that end.
All right. So let's thank our speaker again. And I'd like to make two reminders. One is that the 3D Coform exposition is open throughout next week, but also especially for Sibgrapi, it's open downstairs. So everybody should go take a look and talk to the researchers that help put this together. And the other one is that we do not have a coffee break between this session and the next. So you guys are stuck here for another hour.
Just a quick announcement, a shameless advertisement, that with the opening of the actual opening of the exhibition on Monday, we also have a full day workshop about technologies, 3D technologies applied to cultural heritage. It's free, you just have to register on the site so we know how much coffee we make for you guys. So it's actually going to be here in this room, right, Ursula? Yeah, so on Monday it's a full day workshop. It's on the site. I think we have a link on Sibgrapi. So those of you who are interested, come. Okay?
A gente tem um cafezinho aqui com biscoitinho rapidinho. Não é que nem lá de baixo, mas tem um pouquinho aqui, quem tiver com fome. Obrigada. Imagina, obrigada.